Is there honest communication between the government and the people? How much information should the people know? Do you trust the government? From 1972 to 2020, the American people's reported trust in the government went from 75% to 35%. How could the drop be so drastic in 50 years? On June 13, 1971, Daniel Ellsberg leaked documents that would forever shape the way the public and the government interacted. Throughout history, whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg used communication to expose the government's intentional deception of the people, regardless of personal consequences.
The Pentagon Papers were a secret history of the Vietnam War. The papers exposed miscommunications about the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War has many points that could be considered the beginning. During Kennedy's presidency, he initially opposed military intervention, and upon discovering that South Vietnam was losing, sent more equipment, technicians, and military advisors instead of troops like his inspection team suggested. It wasn't until Johnson's presidency that troops were sent, despite his campaign promise that said otherwise. In July 1964, a Vietnam NVA patrol boat torpedoed a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin.
A number of hostile vessels attacking two U.S. destroyers with torpedoes.
Although the ship was not damaged, the U.S. told Vietnam that any more unprovoked attacks would result in further retaliation. On August 4th, the second destroyer believed it was being attacked and fired back. 2 days after this event, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, letting the U.S. use any necessary measures to prevent further aggression, and allowing Johnson to illegally declare war and send troops to Vietnam. In 1964, military orders changed from defending the Da Nang Air Base to going on the offensive. Troops were sent on patrols to find and kill enemy forces. President Johnson hid this change of orders from the American people. According to Horace Busby, a Johnson advisor, this is no longer South Vietnam's war. We are no longer advisors. The stakes are no longer South Vietnam's. This war is ours. The public saw the Vietnam War just as America's duty to stop communism. Men were sent to fight just as their fathers and grandfathers fought in prior wars. According to retired Army Colonel Tom Hyder,
Vietnam in the mid-60s was just what we did. Everybody did.
Daniel Ellsberg was in the Pentagon when the Gulf of Tonkin news started coming in. Ellsberg was an analyst for the Rand Corporation and was getting an inside look at the Vietnam War. Some things were simply not adding up. He was seeing both sides, what the public was being told and what he saw at work every day. In 1965, Ellsberg began a 3-year trip to Vietnam where he saw what was really going on. It became even more obvious that the government was misleading the public. He began to realize this war is not at all like he had once believed, and determined action needed to be taken. Soon enough, the people noticed how many troops and how much money was being sent to Vietnam, causing the public to question the reality of what was happening overseas. Richard Nixon saw this political unrest and used it to his advantage in an upcoming election. Nixon was in contact with Anna Chennault, the president of a Republican women's group who had connections with South Vietnam's president. He had her tell South Vietnam's president to hold off on a peace treaty so that he could make a promise to the U.S. citizens to send the troops home in the war. The cognitive dissonance Daniel Ellsberg felt between what was being said behind closed doors and what was being told to the public became too much for him to simply ignore. He knew of binders full of classified documents in John McNaughton's office, officially called reported the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, that would eventually become the Pentagon Papers. Kept in a building used by the Rand Corporation, this report had been made at the urging of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the report began in 1967, led by Leslie H. Gleb. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the Truman administration gave military aid to France in their war against Vietnam, and it directly got the U.S. involved in Vietnam. The Eisenhower administration's decision to save a struggling South Vietnam from communist North Vietnam gave the administration a direct role in Vietnam in 1954. The Kennedy administration developed a policy of limited risk gamble into broad commitment, which left President Johnson with the choice of more war or withdrawal. The documents also detailed communications in which people in combat at the Gulf of Tonkin were doubtful of attacks even taking place, when the public believed that's why troops had been sent there in the first place. Daniel Ellsberg decided it was his patriotic duty to communicate this information to the public, regardless of what it would do to him. In a later interview, Ellsberg said, "In our country, patriotism should not be defined as obedience to an authority." One night in the late summer of 1969, he entered the Pentagon with an empty briefcase and came out with it stuffed full of classified documents. He knew he needed copies of these documents because he could not keep the originals for long. Ellsberg reached out to his friend, Anthony Russo, who had access to a copier. Night after night, Ellsberg would bring portions of the documents, copy them, and return them to their place at the Pentagon and exchange them for others. This took place for several weeks. Even his son, Robert Ellsberg, helped copy occasionally. After copying the contents of the report, the next hurdle would be how to communicate these documents to the public. Ellsberg started his effort by approaching members of Congress with the information. He confronted people such as Senator J. William Fulbright, Senator Charles Matthias Jr., Senator George McGovern, and Congressman Paul McCloskey, Jr. All Congress members declined with varying reasons. Some were too worried about the consequences, some wanted to run for president soon, some worried about reputations. Whatever their excuse, none were interested. However, this did lead Ellsberg to the realization that he should approach large newspapers with portions of the documents. In March of 1971, Ellsberg approached Neil Sheehan, a reporter for the New York Times. Ellsberg waited patiently in a nearby hotel while the Times weighed the risks of publishing these documents. Despite the advice of the Times law firm Lord Day & Lord, Sheehan contacted Ellsberg with the confirmation that they would indeed publish some of the documents. On Sunday, June 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon picked up the New York Times to find the front page coverage of his daughter's wedding on the left and the first part of the Pentagon Papers on the right. Even though he accused the people responsible of treason, Nixon wrongly determined that the report showed that the Vietnam War was the fault of past presidents and would not damage him directly. What Nixon and other government officials largely underestimated was the impact that their dishonesty would have on the public. Nixon claimed that the Pentagon Papers was affecting international relations between the US and China. The Miller Center scholar Ken Hughes says that the true reason he was so intent on shutting down the paper's release was the fear that the bombing of Cambodia and the Chinle affair would come to light, both events having been undisclosed to the public. Soon the Times was making day-by-day decisions on whether to continue printing. Meanwhile, assistant manager of the Washington Post, Ben Bagdigan, received a phone call from Daniel Ellsberg wanting the Washington Post to commit to leaking the documents in addition to the Times. Bagdigan couldn't commit the Post himself, but he promised to get back soon. He was given instructions for what to do if they agreed. President Nixon and the head of security made a threat to the New York Times, demanding that they stop printing the articles and that they would be charged with espionage under the Espionage Act of 1917. When Nixon attempted to threaten the Washington Post the same way, the Post simply said he lacked a valid enough basis to stop them from releasing the articles. The Times temporarily stopped releasing the documents. Ellsberg could have faced 115 years of prison time, but he never made it past the trial due to protests and the break of Watergate. When Watergate broke because of Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the information about the Watergate break-in was released, as well as the information that the government had not communicated to the public about the events that occurred during Nixon's administration. After harsh backlash from the people and the reveal of his less than legal activities, Nixon was forced to resign.
As long as we keep agreeing that we can just ignore the issue, it will continue to come back. The conflict between our legal right to know and our moral right to know has not been sorted out. My generation is going to dump that one on you, and you will have to either sort it out or pass it along to your descendants. And I don't know which you'll do.
We continue to ask ourselves the question of if the government is communicating the truth. For example, on June 6, 2013, information released about the government by Edward Snowden told how the government was running a surveillance program that not only monitored the communication records of potential terrorists and criminals, but also normal citizens. He revealed via a hard drive given anonymously to the Washington Post and The Guardian that the government had been tapping into well-known social media platforms, internet companies, audio and video chats, photos, emails, as well as document and connection logs. Several new laws and regulations passed by President Obama helped to limit how citizens' data could be collected and held, though that did not stop the political unrest and wariness from the people towards the government and electronic devices. Others, like Julian Assange, have leaked government information that continues the never-ending cycle of questions about trusting the government. The government hasn't learned their lesson either, forcing people like Daniel Ellsberg to conclude that all governments lie. It's hard to determine what the future holds for communication between the public and the government, but with the help of past and present whistleblowers, we may not always have to guess what's happening behind closed doors.